For those of us in the professional church world, there's a name we've been hearing a lot. It's Ryan Burge. And it's not because he's a biblical scholar or a new theologian. He is a political scientist. He's known for his charts and his fact-based insights on churches in America. And he's also an ordained pastor. And Ryan describes growing up in southern Illinois in the kind of a church where, kind of a community where church is a given. You know, of course, you go on Sundays, and of course you bring a dish to the potluck. And of course your life is spent serving on one committee or another, and take your turn at being moderator of the church council. That's supposed to make you laugh. He went to seminary not because of a dramatic call that he felt, but because it felt like a natural extension of his life growing up in the church. But he also really was interested in research, and so he earned a PhD in political science too. While preaching and visiting in hospital rooms, while burying the dead and baptizing the young, he also was poring over charts and writing articles about the changing religious landscape in America. And he saw in those charts the very things that were happening in his own church. He hadn't baptized a baby in years. On the other hand, it seemed like he had a funeral every month. And so it wasn't a surprise that in 2024 his church decided to close. It was painful. After serving as their pastor for 17 years, he had to give the final benediction for a community that had been faithful for generations. And a year later, he wrote about it and said very simply, "I'm still not over it." Because that church had mattered. It had touched lives. It had been a place where people were known and cared for, and yet that wasn't enough. And to say it wasn't his fault, just look at the numbers, well, that's cold comfort for pastors like him and for countless church members. Well, actually not countless. We have the numbers. Among the 7 mainline churches, the Lutherans, Presbyterians, Methodists, Episcopal, Disciples, American Baptist, the American Baptist, not the Southern, and the UCC, 15,000 churches have closed since 2000. That's roughly 10 million people. And even the Southern Baptists have 4 million fewer members than they had just 10 years ago. And to make it real, the UCC has closed an average of 6 churches every month for 20 years and counting. Now, it's not all at once. In fact, it's hard to even notice as it's happening drip by drip. There's not a dramatic, not a dramatic moment, but just steadily. Over time, a drop from 2 million members in 1960 to 680,000 today. And the remaining churches are smaller. In 1960, the average church had 250 members. Today, it's closer to 90. Or think of it this way, across the mainline church, the majority of congregations are 30, 40, maybe 50 people on a Sunday morning. In a quarter of the UCC, there are 25 or fewer. And given how small, the rate of closure is going to increase exponentially. What has been for decades all along a steady decline will suddenly feel like there's been a collapse all at once. But hear me when I say trends are not inevitabilities. And today we get to see something else. Welcome to Capital Campaign Celebration Sunday. Which is not just about pledges. We are celebrating everything God is doing. And I really mean this, not to tell a story of exceptionalism or self-congratulations, okay? What's important here is to listen to the call and respond. It's a sermon in which we are asked to listen to the call of Jesus and respond. You heard in the scripture, just days after his resurrection, Jesus stood on the beach cooking fish for breakfast. And he called out to his disciples, who hadn't caught a single fish all night long, "Cast your net on the other side." Doesn't that sound like a ridiculous idea? You're on the water. But suddenly their nets were full with this oddly specific number, 153, which are told the nets did not break. But just think, so what changed? They listened to Jesus, and they tried the other side. Texas isn't known for its multitude of open and affirming churches, for its mega churches. And Shelley Washington had given up on them. She was exhausted from years of being demonized from the pulpit, and so she walked away from the church forever. But one day, a friend dragged a reluctant Shelley to St. Peter's United Church of Christ in Houston. When I walked in there, she said, I immediately felt loved. People who didn't know me came right up to me with big smiles. And I thought, okay, God, we'll give it one more try. Now, St. Peter's is one of the oldest churches in Houston, founded in 1848 by 7 German immigrant families. And a great-granddaughter of one of those original families is still there, known affectionately as Miss Evelyn, who was baptized in the church 84 years ago. And she tells the stories of big barbecues when men stayed up all night long to cook, and her grandma made potato salad in a brand new wash tub. A grandma who demanded strict good behavior. No running in church. Sit still on those hard wooden pews, which was especially difficult when guest preachers came and only spoke in German, a language she had no idea what they were saying. And this church had refused to give up its language, and as a result dwindled down to only a few members in 1937. And finally the decision was made to switch, to change from German to English. And members returned, and the church grew, and in 1961 they built a much bigger brick sanctuary. But they kept the original white clapboard sanctuary on the property. Membership peaked in 1966 with 550 members. By 2018, they had 12. They decided to move their worship services back into that smaller original sanctuary, leaving the big brick one empty. And a succession of small congregations rented from them until Cathedral of Hope Houston, which is an offshoot of the 4,000-member Cathedral of Hope UCC in Dallas, which there are some large UCCs. It's also the world's largest predominantly LGBTQ congregation. But the Houston church never really quite took off. And having to repeatedly move from rented spaces meant the church lost members every time. And with their move to St. Peter's, the congregation shrank again, from 23 to 15. But slowly, their membership stabilized. And then this church of mostly older white lesbians called a very different pastor, a young gay black man who helped them become who they'd always imagined themselves to be. And people of all ages began to show up, and different races and ethnicities, straight and gay and transgender, and soon membership doubled, and then tripled, and then quadrupled. And by the end of 2018, Cathedral of Hope in Houston had 85 members. Still a long way from a megachurch, but truly growing. And their needs began to change. And so they thought, maybe we need to do another move, because they weren't sure that St. Peter's, as a landlord, would or could make the changes they now needed. And so Cathedral of Hope lay leaders came with a list of fixes if they were going to renew their lease. St. Peter's leaders proposed no lease, no rent, a merger instead, with St. Peter's historic name and their dynamic pastor. And the Cathedral of Hope members were astonished. This elderly, white, traditional congregation would intentionally meld with this wildly diverse one. An old pump organ would coexist alongside a drum set and a gospel praise band. And not to mention the pastor would be quite a shift. His animated preaching one day caused a button to pop off his robe. And today, 84-year-old Miss Evelyn sings in the gospel choir, unable to sway in sort of the same way, but she stands in the middle beaming with joy. And when Shelley was dragged by her friend to St. Peter's one Sunday, she immediately felt that love and told God, okay, I'm going to give church another try. So when St. Peter's shifted from German to English, when Cathedral of Hope called a pastor who didn't look like the rest of them in the congregation, when the two churches merged and became a unique blend of both, that's Jesus calling from the shore. After fishing all night long, cast your net on the other side of the boat. And what I hear all the time about Mission Hills is what Shelley said about St. Peter's. I felt the love almost immediately. Or another thing I hear, I was startled when the whole congregation announced in unison, "You are welcome here." It has an impact. And our church is truly becoming a blend of those who were baptized here 60 years ago and people who walked in a year ago or even a month ago, finding a sense of maybe there's a home here. We have newer programs sitting alongside long-established ministries that have existed for decades. Worship sometimes includes drums and sometimes only organ and sometimes new music and sometimes something nostalgic, often in the same service, always with intention. And our historic, beautiful sanctuary will soon have a chancel that will be open with a clean look. We have accomplished so much. And yet there are still things we need to listen for, right? There's more discernment to do. Do you remember how Ryan described the church? Of course, you bring a dish to the potluck, and of course you serve on a committee. That's just what people do. Well, it's what people did. That is not how life works for most people anymore. People are stretched. Schedules are full. And the previous way of organizing church doesn't fit the way most people actually live today. I want to give you some particulars. In particular, what we need is to discern a workable model for administrative lay leadership for the next 5 and 10 years from now. You say, well, okay, now what does that mean? Here's the bottom line. Ministry still depends on lay people in leadership. Council members, conveners, project leaders for short-term projects of all different kinds. And we have already built something different. Our governance structure a couple of years ago was changed to a smaller, more nimble, more responsive group. But it still only works if people are willing to step into it. Right? And so we need ways to sustain volunteer engagement without burning people out. The typical thing that has happened in churches across the country is you may have had 1 or 2 or 3 different jobs in a church, but as it has shrunk, it has meant that you have 5 or 6 or 10 different jobs in the church. So we need to sustain volunteers without burning them out. And through it all, that means we need to discern what to hold on to and what to let go of. So again, what can be done is sustained with joy and not exhaustion. Underneath it all, we need ways for people not only to attend, but to actually belong. For those who have been here a lifetime, or just 20 years, or just a couple weeks, to be known, and not just to have more relationships, but deeper ones. We can't do that for people. That has to be a partnership. And most of all, we want to keep growing deeper in our faith in ways that don't just bring us more information, but are about transformation. We have come a long way. And today, as we mark this milestone, let's celebrate all that love. And let's celebrate your generosity. You can look at the numbers. 15,000 churches closed in just the 7 denominations. 10 million fewer people. And the story might seem clear that this is the end of mainline Christianity in America. But it's actually not. What's ending is the way churches have always done church. And fortunately, new models are emerging. It's just they don't look like they did in the 1960s. Now, if you've been part of this congregation for many years, look what God is doing. Look at the abundance that's already here. And if you are newer, there is something unexpected and real happening here. And I hope that you have at least even a glimpse of feeling it. And know that you are invited into it too. We're going to start singing, They'll Know We Are Christians by Our Love, but in like verse 2 or 3, we're going to move and create a circle all the way around the congregation so we can see each other and celebrate when our campaign leaders tell us how we've done. So let's stand and sing, and then when I sort of indicate, let's move into our circle.